Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything.
Greetings and welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here as always at the John Hope Franklin Center on Duke University's campus. And we're honored to be joined today by Professor Suad Abdul Khabeer, who is the author of the book Muslim Cool, Race, Religion, and Hip Hop in the United States, which was published in 2016 by NYU. We are in fact label mates. She is also the creator of the one-woman show Sampled Beats in Muslim Life, and she's currently the Associate Professor of American Culture and future Director of the Arab and Muslim American Studies program at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
You know, when folks decide to do scholarship on hip hop, right, there's always this kind of tension, right? A lot of the real hip hop heads always want to ask scholars, what exactly do you know about this? Right.
Right.
And it's not like the early days, you know, when you were looking at folks like, say, a Trisha Rose or Michael Eric Dyson, right? We're really at a point now where these are folks, you know, like yourself, who have legitimately grown up with hip hop. So what's your hip hop story?
What's my hip hop story? That's a good question. I guess I'll start with like one of my earliest memories of hip hop. So I'm from Brooklyn, and we were at a baby shower, and I was a little kid. And I don't actually think we were in Brooklyn, I think we were in Queens, because it was houses. So I remember. But I remember a car driving by blasting Audio 2, Milk is Chillin'.
Milk is Chillin'.
Yeah, and that's the top billet, right? And to this day, like, I have this memory of being a little kid playing outside of somebody's house or something at some shower, and that, sort of.
That's such a great intro to hip hop. That's such a hip hop song,
yes,
right?
Exactly. So that's kind of, I feel like when I think about it, this is how I remember sort of that in particular. And I have like these moments where it's kind of like that sort of music. And, because oftentimes, when you grow up with hip hop, it's just around you. It's like social.
And you're talking about New York City radio, right? So it was also on the radio.
Yeah, like I remember I had this, which I'm still trying to find. I used to record the top 888, and I had like the tape recorder and the radio, and Buddy was number one from De La that one year, and I had this tape. I'm still trying to find it because I want to hear it again. I remember that, and then also just like when I was older though, and by older I mean like an adult, it was Jean Grey, and encountering her work. And I know she's like big on not being like a female MC, like not being typecast that way. But it was her storytelling that made me realize like how male dominated so much of the storytelling of hip hop is. Because I was like, oh, wait a minute. Like, because I related to what she was talking about in a way that was a lot different than other folks. And so, so for me, it's like from Audio to kind of like Bunny. And I was really into Native Tongues and that kind of stuff growing up. Jean Grey, and then I continue, to sort of have...
Going down a rabbit hole.
Right, exactly.
So were you raised as a Muslim?
I was, yes, okay.
So talk about, the desire to kind of bring that conversation
right, so because,
together.
So I think, so kind of like, so the story of how even Muslim Cool kind of happens, actually, I'll go a little bit forward to do that. I had graduated from college, and I decided to spend a year in Damascus, Syria.
Wow.
Okay, and because there was a leader, Imam Wahdi Muhammad, who's the son of Elijah Muhammad, who's known for sort of transitioning people who were part of the Nation of Islam
into a more mainstream,
right, exactly.
Islam. Yeah.
And so he was sending students to study sort of like traditional Islamic sciences, right? And so I went with a group of students to Damascus. Okay, great. So anyway, I got my undergraduate from Georgetown in like international politics, foreign service. So we used to go to like the American Cultural Center because they would have stuff. So they were having Black History Month programming while I was there, but they were showing He Got Game, Boys in the Hood, and Love and Basketball, and I was appalled. Like,
what is this, right?
What is going on here? So because I was from Georgetown, a friend of mine knew the person who was like the cultural attaché there. Right. So I emailed them like, this is crazy. You should invite Professor Suleiman Yang, who's a scholar of Islam in America at Howard University, to give a talk. Right. And they were like, why don't you give a talk? Yes.
So you got pressed into duty.
Exactly. Right. And so what ended up happening, it was like, okay, well, it's Black History Month, and I'm going to be talking about Islam and Black Muslims and Black people, and how would I talk about that? And the first thing that came to my mind was hip hop, right? And it seemed like this perfect way to sort of open up this conversation. Yeah. And this is happening, like I left for Damascus in October of 2001. And so, and I was supposed to leave in September, but we didn't because of September 11th. And so in my mindset, what's also happening is that I know there's a conversation happening about Islam now in Muslims, right. And they're not talking about me.
Right.
Like I know that's what's happening. And so I'm also interested in intervening in that because I know that there is a community and communities that I come from and represent that are really significant and central, foundational to any conversation we're going to have about Islam, Muslims, the United States, the globe.
Yeah.
And they're not there.
You know, if you're in mainstream Black community, say 30 years ago, right, and you're talking hip hop and Islam, the only context for that is the Nation of Islam on one hand, and the 5% Nation, right? You know, I knew far more about the 5% Nation and, you know, Duquesne and Rakim and Poor Righteous Teachers than I ever knew about mainstream Islam. And of course, the Nation of Islam didn't really help in that context. Also, did you find in the early days of your research that folks were kind of surprised about the presence of kind of mainstream Black Muslims and their relationship with hip hop?
Well, to be honest, I think folks were surprised about any Islam. So in my own work, I include the Nation and I include the 5%, Ahmadiyas, different groups that have relationships with Islam under this banner Black Islam, because I think they are connected. I think they're connected. You know, the divisions that we make sometimes as scholars are useful, but they aren't complete, right? And so these communities, people are interacting with each other. They're going between different communities, and they're sharing really this commitment to Black liberation, right? Through a kind of Islamic inspired lens. So I'm connecting them, right? So in my own work. And so whether it's Nation or 5% or I'm sort of Sunni Islam, people are just surprised. They're like, really? You know, I just had a conversation with someone like that who's like, you know, I never thought about Islam and hip hop ever, which for me as someone is like,
it's kind of surprising, right? I mean, if you're actually a real hip hop head, you really can't not find the connection.
Right. And so I think I think oftentimes what's happening, at least in my experience, is that people are thinking about hip hop and they're specifically focusing on sort of commercially profitable and what's on the radio right now. Right. And what's on the radio right now, even though and when I give talks, I demonstrate even on what's on the radio right now, we see this influence, but it's not as explicit by far, right? So they're thinking about that, and they're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And for them, Islam is this religion of Arab people from somewhere else, you know, from some other land somewhere, and so that's also not hip hop, right? And so that's actually what people are like, oh.
Because it does two things. One, it discounts the reality of immigration from African countries of folks who actually are practicing Muslims. And then, of course, this longer history of Islam in Black communities. Right,
exactly.
You know, I think about when you mentioned that, you know, there's no resonance for that in the mainstream hip hop. I think about a figure like Odyssey, you know, out of DC, who's actually going to spend some time here at Duke soon. You know, you don't hear him on the radio, right? Exactly. You know, so you wouldn't know those kind of connections. I showed a clip to my students of Ice Cube's True to the Game. And, you know, they don't know angry Ice Cube. And they certainly
know SVU Ice Cube.
They certainly don't know, you know, who Khalil Muhammad is, in that context. And I think they were a little thrown off because it's like, this is like a history that we don't know.
Yes, and I think that is true too for students. Like one of the things I do, people talk about like contemporary, you know, mainstream radio hip hop. And it's like, you know, ASAP Ferg has a song comes out in the remix and Nicki Minaj is on it and they're saying Alhamdulillah and Mashallah, right? Which are terms that come from, you know, Muslim tradition, I mean, all praise to God. And I always tell people, you know, so the thing about neither one of those artists are Muslim, although ASAP Ferg, his grandfather actually was Muslim.
That's interesting.
Nicki Minaj's family's from Trinidad, right? Which has a huge Muslim population that's both Black and Indian descent. And she's from Queens. So there's no surprises here to me that this would kind of pop up and appear. And the thing that's most important, though, about their references or using those terms is that they use them correctly. So it's like, it's not in a religious context, but they're actually deploying the term in a way that actually is correct for how you use that term.
In a very kind of social context, right?
And so, which I think speaks to, again, like sort of the kind of a durability of sorts in terms of this influence and relationship between Islam and hip hop. Because in many ways, what I talk about is this idea of Islam as a part of Black vernacular culture, right? And so people, just everyday folks in different kinds of ways are engaging with, have engaged, whether it's because they got a cousin named Rashid, or like the guy who ran the bodega,
right?
You know, like they have
or some cat that you went to high school with who changed his name.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes, right.
One of the things, you're a real big contribution to the conversation now, right? Is this idea of Muslim cool. What you talk about on the one hand is a way for Black Muslims to deal with white supremacy, but it's also to deal with anti-Black racism within traditional Muslim communities. Talk a little bit about that dynamic.
Yeah. So definitely, like I say, Muslim cool is this way of kind of addressing sort of what I call these kind of overlapping kind of sort of hegemonies of anti-Blackness, because we're accustomed to and we know what it means, what white supremacy means in terms of Black folks, right? But then what does it mean in terms of sort of non-Black people of color who are also Muslim, right? And so the things that I kind of talk about in the book are around how anti-Blackness appears, right, is in kind of a devaluation. So in terms of if Black Muslims do something, it's kind of already and always suspect, right? And this idea that because of this kind of almost like a conflation of the anti-Blackness they learn when they come to the country about Black people as being downwardly mobile, morally, kind of questionable in their behaviors, this kind of thing, right? So that kind of intersects with their sort of interactions with Black people, right? And so who then are Muslim. And so then, people will tell stories about, then you go to a mosque and someone's asking you, when did you convert? Right, which should not be a bad thing, because but actually it's a question of kind of undercutting your legitimacy and authority when it comes to religion. When did you get out of prison?
Right, because obviously that's where you converted.
Which again also is not a bad thing, in and of itself. But again, it's sort of reifying these things. So you'll find so you'll find these kinds of sort of behaviors and attitudes that really circumscribe, right? Your ability to maneuver and navigate in a community, your ability to have authority in a community, your ability to see yourself reflected in the activities, events of the community. And then likewise, because the way it plays itself out, because of how it intersects with sort of kind of larger anti-Blackness, your ability to be representative and seen as authority of Muslims outside of the community, right? Which is also something that comes up. And so oftentimes, people talk about the Muslim as a racial type, right? And this racial type is someone who's quote unquote brown, they're from someplace else, they speak a different language, this kind of thing, which is in itself an anti-Black move, right? Because it's meant to erase that Black people were here and doing anything in their contributions.
We're joined today on Left of Black by Professor Suad Abdul Khabeer. She's author of the book Muslim Cool, Race, Religion, and Hip Hop in America, published by NYU Press in 2016. One of the other challenges of thinking about hip hop and Islam is that people don't think about hip hop as having any connection with religion. And to the extent that most mainstream Americans think about Islam as even being a legitimate religion. Right. It probably presents some challenges.
So one of the things I think, hip hop, people tend to look at it kind of in these, I think, like polarizing ways, right? So it's either this like folk thing that comes directly from the people that's really pure and, unadulterated truth, or is this totally commodified commercial, just, gross capitalist product, right? And the thing about hip hop and just Black popular culture in general, right, is that sort of it's all of these things. It's these things and many things in between. And so the presumption that hip hop has nothing to do with spirituality is coming out of that space, right? Well, this is this Black pop culture, is this music thing, it's over here. But indeed, hip hop, I think, in and of itself, is always talking about sort of existential questions, right? Like, what is it, who am I? What am I doing here? What does it mean to be here? And in fact, we talk about hip hop in terms of elements, right? So we'll talk about like it's artistic, so MCing and DJing, graffiti, dance, and then there's the fifth element, knowledge, right? And knowledge of self, which comes directly from the Nation of Islam, right? So you have this idea, which also comes from Islam more broadly, right? But taken up by sort of early hip hop pioneers from the Nation of Islam as a way of thinking about learning about where you come from, so you can understand where you are, and so you can respond to the conditions right now. And I think for me, even in the most kind of, morally, I don't know, even the kind of hip hop that you like, oh, there's nothing redeemable here, right? I think even in that you find it. If you listen close enough, right? You hear that. You hear that impact. And so I think if people aren't thinking about that, they don't think it's there. But I also think they're not listening, and they're not really paying attention, right? Because you think, similar with when I was talking to someone who said they didn't know that Islam had a relationship to hip hop, when it comes to religion and spirituality, it's because of what you think those things already are.
Right.
And therefore you don't see it.
And when you don't see it reflected, in the music, right?
But it doesn't mean it's not there, right? It means that your conception of that is typically very narrow and not really reflecting, I think, what it actually, even what you've actually experienced sometimes, when it comes to religion and spirituality.
I remember when Get Rich and Die Trying came out, and I was having this kind of moment where I wasn't necessarily trying to deal with any of this. I've had several of these moments over the years. But then I listened to Many Men, and I was like, he's actually working through some deep philosophical and spiritual questions about why he's actually still here. And I'm like, whoa.
Exactly. You're like, okay. And I think, and it's powerful, and examples like that, and recent stuff like one of my favorite tracks from Kendrick Lamar, and like Black of the Berry, which I know is like sort of controversial too in terms of kind of its ending, but I think, but what he's talking about is like, I'm in this position, I'm here, there are these sort of expectations about who I am. I'm sort of kind of living up to them because of this, but I kind of know I shouldn't do that. And like, how do I figure that out, right? Which is this is not light, soft, easy.
No. These are the existential questions that religion folks always go to religion for responses to.
Right, exactly. So I think, I think you find that over and over again in the music and the culture. And so part of sort of what I do, and other scholars like me, is sort of kind of make that apparent. Right? Bring it out so other folks can see and appreciate it too.
So you're an ethnographer, trained at Princeton. How'd you end up in Chicago?
Right. So I actually initially, I had a whole circuitous, word, right, kind of thing. I went to graduate school to talk about, so my background is, I'm Black, I'm Latina, I'm from New York, and so I went to graduate school to kind of talk about Muslims like me, right, to kind of bring those stories out. Then I decided I really like music, and I was like, I'm going to do something on reggaeton, right? I went to Puerto Rico, because my family's from Panama, so Panama is like the origins for reggaeton, so I was like going to do this thing about circulation and music and all this kind of whatever. Puerto Rico ended up in Morocco, because in Puerto Rico they were trying to find a religious leader who spoke like Spanish and Arabic and English, and so whatever. So I end up in Morocco, and then I get to Morocco, and there's all this hip hop. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm gonna do this. So I'm like gonna go to Morocco, and then I meet this man. His name is Rami Nashashibi, and he runs this organization called IMAN, the Inner City Muslim Action Network, that's based in Chicago. And I meet him at this meeting, and he's like, you should come see what we're doing out here. Because what they were doing out there was really sort of promoting arts-based activism around issues of racial inequality, social economic inequality on the southwest side of Chicago, and hip hop was central to that. So when I went to, I was like, okay, so I went out there and I checked it out, and I was like, there's a really important story here. And initially I was going to do a comparative, like Morocco, Chicago thing, but I got married, and it was like,
you can't disappear
So like,
for 6 months.
Right.
The challenge of the partnered anthropologist.
Exactly.
Who's not partnered with another anthropologist. Because then you both can go in the field at the same time.
At the same time. And so, and I had done my traversing across the globe already, like as a student, so I wasn't pressed for that. So I decided I'm just going to stay here. And there was more than enough. Sort of richness and depth. I mean, Chicago, as a New Yorker, I have this, total bias and, kind of snobbishness or whatever. But, Chicago has this really deep musical history.
It's a nice city.
And it's like, and all this stuff is happening there, and the community dynamics. And so it's like, there's tons to kind of learn from here. And so I ended up staying in Chicago. Although the research question did take me to other places. Like I ended up in the UK for a little bit to do some research. I talked to folks in California because Muslim cool, right? This idea of this group of young Muslims who are engaging hip hop as a way to be Muslim, to sort of challenge anti-Blackness, has a home in Chicago, but is not only in Chicago, right? And in many ways, it's a network of folks really around the world at this point who are kind of doing similar things, and they come together at different points. And so Chicago was my sort of foundational space, and then I found myself, following where the questions were taking me.
You mentioned that you began to think about this research going to Damascus right around 9/11. The book comes out literally just after the election of Donald Trump.
Right.
And so, what do these conversations look like? I mean, you talked a little bit about what they look like in the 9/11 moment. What do these conversations look like in the Trump era?
Yeah, so I think we still find ourselves in a space where this question of who Muslims are and their belonging, right, has been ramped up even more with sort of the election of Donald Trump. And so part of like why Muslim cool is important, like in terms of me, has been about sort of pushing that back, right? But this is kind of like Donald Trump, let's say Donald Trump and Black Lives Matter, because it's like pushing that back, but not only to create space for Muslims in this kind of multicultural, salad bowl of American exceptionalism. Like that's not the idea here, right? Because that's not what hip hop generates from.
Right.
So the idea here is that pushing back against anti-Muslim racism, because you want to address the fundamental challenge of anti-Black racism, on which anti-Muslim racism is built, right? And so, and this is what's important about Black Muslims, and like I have a blog that I run called Sapelo Square that focuses on Black Muslims, and because part of what I think Black Muslims represent, both in terms of like real life stuff, but also conceptually, is a way of sort of keeping us honest, like as a country, and continuing to push and to challenge, so that not that we have a seat at the table, but that we build something different. Right. And so I think that is what Muslim Cool is about right now, right? It's like, it's not, even when I started, I think even the project, I think I was focused more on this kind of Muslims are people too, like type of framing. But as I developed and I grew like in my scholarship and in my analysis, I realized like that is not really the issue and that's not the problem, right? And so how do we use the conversations we have around Muslim to have conversations around Blackness and anti-Blackness, which is so fundamental to sort of what is not working and what has not worked here in the United States.
So I've seen photos of your one-woman show. And I remember I'm kind of like, wow, she's really athletic, right? She looks like she's actually B-girl. And I'm like, we need to get her and Joe Sloss together and y'all have like a B-boy, B-girl battle. But talk a little bit about this one-woman show that you developed.
Yeah, so I do some top rocking. I now have some arthritis in my knees, so the floor work doesn't happen as much anymore. I always like to say hip hop is like a Sufi tariqa. So like you have to have a chain, right? And so I have a teacher, Mirasaka, who studied with Pop Master Fable. And so I'm like, I have my chain. Right,
so you got your credit.
right. But so, and I worked with her, for example, because so the show itself is inspired kind of not by hip hop in the sense that it's inspired by The Color Museum by George C. Wolfe, and For Color Girls by Ntozake Shange, which are things that I saw as a child. I think I saw The Color Museum like on PBS. That
really pushes the boundaries about what we think about stable Blackness.
And this idea of this form of sort of vignettes and kind of sort of they're separate, but they're together and they tell different kinds of stories, right? And so what I do in Sampled, in the title, Sampled Beats of Muslim Life, like it's taken from sort of sampling in terms of hip hop, but also citations in the academy. And what I try to do is kind of tell different stories. So I'm trying to do two different things. I'm trying to bring the stories of Muslim Cool out of the book into something that's in the flesh, in time, and more accessible. Right?
Folks can
connect with folks. But I'm also, I think, trying to push boundaries sort of academically, because we call it in the sort of the one-woman show in like academic terms is called performance ethnography, right? Which is something that is kind of championed at least in anthropology tradition by people like Catherine Dunham and Zora Hurston, who are saying, who are studying Black folks, studying what they're doing, and then bringing their performative, what they're doing performatively, sort of into their research as a way of understanding what's going on and of representing what's going on.
Thinking about E. Patrick Johnson and his Sweet Tea performance piece.
Exactly. And so, so the thing that you see, the athletic thing, right, is like the opening scene, which is called Fatima, where basically the scene opens where sort of I'm like I'm a college student, right? So I kind of have a book pack on, headphones. In the current iteration, DNA is playing, right? And then I'm like, oh, it's time to pray. And this is not, I'm not talking, it's time to pray. I take everything off, and then I do sort of a cycle of prayer, the movements. And then I put my hands up in supplication, and it's my voice reciting a verse from the Quran plays, and then it moves from that to kind of the break in the root song, "Love of My Life," and then so to dance, and then come back to prayer.
Wow.
Like, so this is what happens. Wow. And the idea here is what I'm trying to sort of demonstrate and reflect upon is the seamlessness. So the same ways in which we were talking about how, spirituality, existential questions are all throughout hip hop, and you don't notice it because it isn't demarcated. It isn't like the religion is here and the music is here, right? And so likewise, in the lives of my teachers, the people that I was working with in Chicago, and my own life, right? The relationship between hip hop and Islam, between hip hop and spirituality is likewise. And so what I'm trying to represent through movement and music and performance is how that actually works.
Comes together.
Yeah. So that's the that part. And then there are other scenes that talk about, surveillance in the United States, kind of historically. This one particular thing I did where I found a bunch of press releases from the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Illinois, sort of talking about basically entrapment cases, and then pairing that with the sort of the FOIA documents we have now of the FBI surveillance of the Nation of Islam, which is also using also using informants. I do work in the book, and this came up in the show too, on dandyism, right? And the ways in which Black Muslim men primarily are using dress to challenge anti-Blackness.
That's interesting.
And so I kind of have a monologue on that. So there's lots of different pieces that come in the show. And, folks, I think so the audiences appreciate it, they get it. I like to always tell people it's so much harder than writing a book. And writing a book is not easy, right? But it's much harder. I have a director, Sunita Sarat, who I work with in Chicago. Like I said, Amira Sackett, like I work on dance. It's like, because you have to, execution, right? So in the same ways that you're like, you have your editor and they go back and forth, it's like, you gotta edit this, figure it out, to make sure that you're actually communicating what you wanna communicate, but also it's open enough that people get different stuff out of it. Yeah.
We've been joined today by Professor Suad Abdul Khabeer. She's Associate Professor of American Culture at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and she's the author of the book Muslim Cool that was published in 2016 by NYU Press. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.